I've got a whole stack of demos, some of which involve bouncing around through multiple databases on multiple database versions. So they all may crash and burn often. And this is the question. I get TNS errors using the containers clause. Why? Why is SQLnet even involved? Well, the answer is it's complicated. That's probably the best way of describing it. It's a bit complicated. So what I thought I'd do is we'd go through a little bit of what the containers clause is, literally in the demo, and then we'll try to talk about why you might get TNS errors and also how to work around them. This one might take a little while. But as you can see, this is what we've got. We've got two PDBs, PDB1 and PDB2, they're both open. And first, I want to explain what the containers clause is. So I'm connecting a system. I'm just being lazy here. Please don't ever create objects in the system schema. I just couldn't be bothered creating my own local user accounts that were common across PDBs. So I'm using system here because it's already their common user. Creating a table called demo. I'm then going to jump into, so that was in the root. I'm then going to jump into the PDB1 and create the same table there. I'm then going to jump into PDB2 and create the same table there. So I've actually got three tables called demo here under the system schema, one in the root and one in the two PDBs. If I now connect back as the root, so I'm back in the root, this is what the containers clause is. It lets you run a query against an object in all the different pluggables, including the root. That's pretty cool. So if you have, for example, especially when it comes to the world of application containers, if you have commonly described objects in multiple pluggables, you can actually query across the pluggables with a single command. That's pretty cool. So in a nutshell, that's what the containers clause does. Lets you run a query that spans multiple PDBs. As a DBA, this could be really useful for things like querying things like the $V performance views. So selecting, no problems. Now I'll try, if I look at those PDBs, each one's got a unique container ID. It's got container ID 3 is PDB1, container ID is number 5 is PDB2. Now DML is also supported with the containers clause. I'm doing an insert here and I'm going into container ID number 3, which should be PDB1. Now this should work, but in this case it doesn't. I get a TNS no listener. And this is the first evidence that was provided to me from the question that came in from one of our community members. So we have here the first problem involved with the containers clause. And I had to do a bit of digging with this because some of my databases, not this one, worked fine with the containers clause and some didn't. Now my first thought was, well, if it's a TNS error, maybe my listener is not running or there's something wrong with it. But I did a listener control status. If I scroll back a bit, I did listener control status. And you can see here's my listener. It looks like it's running. It's supporting lots and lots of services. That seems to be doing all the normal stuff that I would expect. If I look at my alert log, this is just the last 50 lines of the alert log. I can see I've got this TNS low listener. So that's the error I got. But the key thing here is a little bit further up. What happens is the way we actually do DML and some of these container style operations is over SQLnet, and we can see how it's actually doing. It's trying to connect to this gobbledygook service name on this host, which happens to be this machine, and it's connecting on port 1521, which is the default port. Now, why can't it see my listener on the default port? Well, I'm a DBA. I'm obviously always very, very security conscious. So I never run things on the default port. If I go back to my listener status, I can see I actually run my listener on port 1519. I chose 19 because it's a 19C database. So out of the box, the containers clause needs SQLnet, needs to use the listener. And unless otherwise specified, it's always going to use the host and port 1521. So the question is, how do I let the database know that when it needs to talk to pluggables from the root via SQLnet, how do I let it know that it needs to talk through a particular port that's not the default? And this is why a lot of people probably have never seen this because they're probably running the default ports. So I connect back to the root as sysdba, and I found this in the documentation. I'll explain where I found the documentation later on. But I can go into each of the containers. I go to PDB1 and I can do this clause, alter pluggable database containers port equals 1519. And just for completeness to show you, although it was correct already, I also can set the host. So it's actually, I set the host and I set the port for this particular container. I then go into PDB2 and do the same thing. I'm letting the root know this is how you get to me in a containers clause when it's required. Don't forget, we saw that doing the select star with a containers clause was fine. It was only the DML in this particular case. So I've set these, can reconnect as system admin, and I'll try to do my DML again with fingers crossed. And guess what? It's not going to work. I can immediately tell from the length of time it takes. Now I have actually done the correct settings, but I need to do more. Let's try bouncing the pluggables. So I'll go to PDB1, close it and reopen it. I'll go to PDB2 and I'll close it and reopen it. So they've both been bounced now to hopefully pick up those new host and port settings. Connect to system admin, have another shot at it, and sadly, it still doesn't work. My understanding is that if you have changed that host setting, change that port setting in order to convey to the listener that you need SQLnet to communicate through a different port, then the only way they get picked up is for the entire database to be bounced. Now, I've set that running. This will take about 60 seconds, unfortunately, because that's how Windows machines go. While we're doing that, let me jump back to the slides briefly. If I go look in the documentation under alter pluggable database, in all the versions of the documentation, there is an alter pluggable database and a PDB settings clause. There's a set command here, but you won't see anywhere in the documentation. There's a set container map, there's set default, a few other set clauses. But unfortunately, in the documentation, it has yet to catch up with this. In alter pluggable database, there is no reference in any of the syntax guide for set containers host, set containers port. So that's why this one took a little bit of a while to nut out. Now, if it's not the documentation, how did I come across it? There's another technology sitting around inside the Oracle database called Proxy PDBs. A PDB can serve as a proxy to another. And the way Proxy PDBs work is they communicate over SQLnet. It is in the Proxy PDB settings that you actually have this, you can set the host clause and you can set the port clause. So it was actually tucked away in the multi-tenant guide, was the hint that this syntax actually existed and that it was required for Proxy PDBs. It turns out that DML through the containers clause must be doing some sort of similar proxy style of operation. Let's see if my bounce has come. Yep, so my database has now been bounced and we're back and running. Let's give it another go now that I've bounced the database. I connect to system admin and voila. Now that the database has been bounced, the entire database has been bounced, it's picked up those settings for host and port. And I can see I had two pluggables. One was container number 3, which was PDB1. One was container number 5, which was PDB2, and both inserts work. I commit those changes, I do a select, and you can see that actually in each of the pluggables now, in pluggable number 3, which is PDB1, pluggable number 5, PDB2, I've actually got a row in each table. If you encounter a TNS listener error when trying to do the containers clauses, whether it's DML or select or whatever, it's actually being implemented in some way under the covers, similar to the way we do proxy PDBs. You need to have your host and port set. Let's continue on a bit and look at some more examples of this, because I'm sure many people aren't using the containers clause. Let's see the way it works and some of the things you have to be aware of. One of the things you'll see is a delete from a containers clause doesn't span containers. You saw on the previous screen that we had 2 rows across the 2 tables in each of the pluggables, one in each of the pluggables. Yet a delete from containers deletes nothing. Deletes must be qualified with a container ID. They need to reach into each container to do a delete. And you might be thinking, well, I'll just do an in clause. I'll do where container ID in 3 and 5, because I know that's my 2 pluggable databases. That won't work. That's an unsupported condition. So a delete from a containers clause, if I'm trying to access all the pluggables by using con ID in, something like that, is not permitted. The only thing that's permitted is to nominate a single container ID. So I can do delete from system demo where container ID equals 3, pluggable number 1, delete from system demo where container ID equals 5, which is pluggable number 2, and then I can commit and the rows are gone. So that's the restriction on delete. You have to dive into each individual container. Now that I've deleted those rows, let's put those rows back in. So I insert a row into pluggable number 1, container 3, insert a row into pluggable 2, which is container 5. Let's do a query. I don't see anything. Now, why is that? Once again, don't forget, pluggable databases are like distinct databases in their own right. We've done effectively a distributed transaction. And so from the root, what I can't actually see is uncommitted transactions. It's like looking into different sessions. I must commit all the changes. And that's effectively like a distributed commit, like a two-phase commit. And once that's done, now my query can reach out to the individual pluggables and actually pick them up through the containers clause. It's not just a case of, oh, I can just whack in a containers clause and everything works exactly like normal. It is a syntactical convenience for you to actually reach across pluggables. But don't forget, pluggables are distinct things in their own right. We are effectively doing a little bit of distributed database trickery here. So I've deleted those rows. I've inserted one row. So now I've just got one row. Okay, so I've cleared up the 2 rows. I'm just putting one row in pluggable number 1. So I've only got one row in my containers table. This is so I can do a little bit of PL SQL on it with some single row fetches. Let's start with a real simple query. I'm doing declare a ref cursor and in PL SQL, open a ref cursor for select star from system.demo. No problems there, that seems to work fine. The reason that works fine is of a PL SQL optimization. And in fact, the database does this in many places. If you just open a cursor, all the database does is do a very loose paths check on that, because why bother? Why bother doing any work to open a cursor? Because unless someone does the first fetch, why bother? If they never fetch from it, I've saved myself some work. So yes, this does work, but we're actually not doing a great deal here. Let's actually go ahead and do something. So this time I'm going to open the ref cursor and I'm actually going to fetch. Now, as we know, that select star from the containers gives me the con ID column, which has the pluggable number, and it has the column X, the one column we created in our table called system.demo. So I'm going to fetch select star and fetch them into these 2 columns. Let's see what happens. Oh, I'm missing a pause. Well, as I said, there's a bit of variability in our scripts today. What happened there, unfortunately, it flicked off the screen, is we actually got an error. And the error was, it said you were trying to fetch a single column into 2 result variables, because PL SQL does not know about the con ID column, even though it comes back when you do a select star from the containers clause. And hopefully this one doesn't clear the screen, because this was just a further example of that. I'm doing select con ID X from containers system.demo. I get an error, which is actually similar to what you would have seen on the previous screen. The error is at compile time, the PL SQL engine doesn't know about this thing called the con ID. And I don't know the specific internals, but my guess is what's happening is containers.systemdemo returns to the calling environment just the contents of the system.demo table, just that single column called X. And then the containers clause is responsible for prepending the con ID column so you know which pluggable it came from. My guess is the PL SQL engine compiles that before the containers clause has actually executed. It's at execution time we add the con ID column. This is my hypothesis, unproven, but as a result, PL SQL struggles. It doesn't understand this con ID column because it doesn't exist in PL SQL's eyes yet. So interestingly, if I just refer to the column, the actual true column in the table, then PL SQL is fine. If I actually want to reference that con ID column, so here's the exact same example we had before that disappeared off screen, but notice the key thing here is I've made it dynamic SQL. So I'm not actually compiling this particular SQL, I've made it dynamic. So it's actually a string, I'm doing select star, so it should give me the con ID and the X column, and I can fetch it into C1 and C2. Let's see if it works, and it does. So if you're using the containers clause in PL SQL, there's a very good chance you're going to have to revert to a little bit of dynamic SQL in your code because the conid column doesn't seem to be available to the PL SQL compiler until actual execution time. Here's one that's maybe not so good. I'm back in the root container. So the container ID is 1. I'm going to use a PL SQL insert command now, but I'm going to use a bind variable. So I'm going to declare I want this to go into container number 5, which happens to be PDB2. And that bind variable goes into my insert statement. I'm saying insert into this container, but I'm nominating the container ID, which is this, which should be the value of 5. This should go into pluggable number 2. And as we can see, it ran just fine. Let's see where the value of 20 ended up. It ended up in container number 1, the one I'm currently in. I'm pretty sure that's a bug, but you can see at the moment, when it comes to PL SQL and the containers clause, you're going to have to take a little bit of care. There's a few issues around containers. Other than that, the technology is pretty cool. For a DBA, if you're managing a single database, single multi-tenant database, which has hundreds of pluggables in it, and if you're running, any of our sort of engineered systems, they can scale out to ridiculous amounts. You can put a whole stack of pluggables on there. Being able to very quickly scan across all those pluggables rather than having a bazillion scripts that do alter session set container equals pluggable 1, pluggable 2, pluggable 3, pluggable 1000, or create database link that points to pluggable 1, pluggable 2, pluggable 3. The containers clause is a very, very nice syntactical convenience to let you span all of them. Just be a little bit careful when you're dealing with PL SQL. And heading right back to the first part here, if you get TNS listener errors, then make sure you do your alter pluggable database, set containers host, set containers port, and that's going to solve your problems. So that's pretty cool.